Well, hi everyone, and welcome to this Eden Formation training session. And today we will be talking about staying sane in ministry, and I'm joined by Will van der Hart and Rob Waller, and they are from the Mind and Soul Network. Will is Anglican Vicar of St Peter's Church in West Harrow, London, and Rob is a consultant psychiatrist up in Scotland. Guys, why don't you just introduce the Mind and Soul Network for us?
Rob. Well, thanks, Anna. The idea behind Mind and Soul, I guess, is partly what you see in Will and I sitting around this table, which is someone who brings theology and I bring psychology and psychiatry, and we try and do the best of both and bring them together. And there's a few other people on the team, but it's bringing those two things together. The best of both is what we're all about.
Great, thank you.
We've been running for about 8 or 9 years, blogging online. We host blogs, podcasts, film, run conferences nationally, and also we network together mental health professionals who are Christians and also Christians who've got an interest in psychology and psychiatry and mental health issues, so works well.
Fantastic. Well, hopefully we'll have a really interesting discussion today. And I guess the first question that I had in mind was, what is ministry? If we're thinking about how to stay sane in ministry, it's important to recognise what it is that we're talking about. So perhaps it'd be good for each of us to say, what does ministry look like for you? So, I mean, for me, ministry looks a lot like running small groups with people in urban communities, digging into how they see the Bible and how they engage the Bible with daily life. It often means being hospitable and being interrupted and having your nice, neat plans for what you're doing rewritten by the events of people's lives, and having to be sensitive to the Holy Spirit in all of that. So that's ministry for me. How about you, Will?
Yeah, ministry for me is leading a church of about 250 people. And we have a community base where we have 37 different user groups in our church during the week. So there's an awful lot of stuff going on. Obviously working with Rob in Mind and Soul, and also networking more broadly in London, in the Diocese of London, working with other vicars and trying to address lots of social issues in our neighbourhood, and also preaching and teaching, praying for people in the power of the Holy Spirit, and hoping to see Jesus transforming lives in the very present. So yeah, ministry for me is all of that, and I guess life with family and friends. You know, it doesn't stop in church.
Yeah. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the Mind and Soul bit is in terms of hours, is quite a small bit of what I do. The odd day like this, some evenings during the week. So I'm part of a local church called Central up in Edinburgh. So I'm involved in their activities, small groups, talking to other parents at the school gate, that sort of thing. My sort of main calling, I suppose, as a psychiatrist is not primarily a Christian calling, because I work for the NHS, but there's quite a lot of discussions about faith and spirituality within that, and even though I'm not being explicit about my Christianity, I see that very much as part of my ministry.
Fantastic. It's so unique, isn't it? Ministry will be different for every single person. And that means it's different in the terms of the way that we all respond to our ministry situations as well. Ministry calls different things out of us at different times. And I guess as we think about how to stay sane in ministry over the long term, there are two angles maybe that be good for us to talk about. Two expressions maybe of what could be difficult or crisis orientated in ministry, either an immediate event or perhaps a slow burn of the long haul. Will, you've had some experience of working in a very difficult circumstances in London. If you could share some of that with us.
Yeah, when I was a curate, I was working in the centre of London, just off Baker Street, and I remember going to work one morning to our offices at St Mary's Bryanston Square, just opposite Edgware Road Station. And my wife was on her way to Oxford, so I was walking her just to Paddington Station, and I walked past a hastily erected cordon by the side of Edgware Road, and in London cordons go up all the time, so you don't really think too much about it. But I remember putting my wife on the train, walking back to my office, and I had a really strong sense, I believe it was the Holy Spirit prompting me, that something much more serious had taken place. And I don't often wear a dog collar, but I went home and I put it on, a bit like a kind of donning your Superman sort of outfit. Here I am and I'm ready for action. And I came back out of my house and I went to the cordon, and I basically went under the cordon. At the same time, a man who was kind of covered in smoke and ash was running down the road towards me, and he mooted something about bodies and people in the station. And I kind of gulped and carried on walking forward, believing somehow that my ministry, my calling was to be present in that sort of an experience. And subsequently connected the police. They used our hall as their operations base, and we were in the middle of the 7/7 bombings. Got some really stark memories from the day, particularly when there was about 200 service personnel in our hall who asked me for a TV because all the telephone networks had gone down. And they said if I got a TV, and I ran up to my flat and brought down a little 14-inch colour TV. And I remember putting it on the altar and standing around it with all these big burly firemen and very distraught police personnel. And we watched the television to try and understand what was going on more broadly in London. And then the London bus bomb went off pretty much directly as we put the television sort of in view. And I think the atmosphere in the room changed from being a kind of understanding of a single crisis to the understanding that we were actually under some sort of terrorist attack. I remember vomiting on the floor, but not thinking very much of it. And I remember the sort of numb activity of trying to help and pray and serve food and be present. And then about 3 months later, I remember returning to London and passing the same spot and being frozen, kind of cold with anxiety, shaking, beginning to have panic attacks, feeling very angry towards local people who could potentially represent those people who are responsible, feeling very disconnected from the people around me, and suddenly also wondering about my own sanity, sort of really thinking, I'm losing it, something's going seriously wrong here. And that was really the beginning of what some psychiatrists like Rob might call a post-traumatic stress experience. And it was really the initiation for me of an understanding of an anxiety disorder, which actually I don't want to pin on the experience of the 7/7 bombings solely. When I look beyond the 7/7 bombings to earlier life, I can see that I had a disposition towards anxiety, even as a young child. But very often when we're working in ministry, we'll be exposed to the things that might trigger latent experiences within us, that might bring to life our vulnerabilities. And for me, the 7/7 bombings were the initiator of an understanding that I had a problem with anxiety. And I've subsequently recovered, and that's part of my involvement with Minor Solid. It was Rob's help and our enduring friendship from our time at university together that really helped me understand myself, and subsequently has led me to gain a far deeper understanding of psychology. But I would encourage everyone who's engaging with this program to be aware that in ministry they're very often exposed to the catalysts which will lead them to have some sort of shaking engagement with a mental health experience, either anxiety or potentially depression or some other trauma.
And processing those community tragedies. I mean, the 7/7 bombings was a huge event, and yet we see in our Eden communities all the time just a far higher proportion of unexpected, unanticipated death, often in young people. Tragedy happens on a regular basis, and actually for team members trying to process some of that and assist people in processing it themselves, having that twin role of trying to rationalise something for somebody else whilst trying to deal with it yourself and having questions yourself can be incredibly challenging.
Yeah, there's a great displacement taking place, as a person takes on a role, and often they displace their own emotion and they absorb the community atmosphere, the sort of the corporate holding, which can be fear or aggression or disbelief. So in ministry, we have this incarnational ministry to be the presence of Christ in our communities, and we're called to enable and empower an emotional narrative to be raised up through the people we're working with. But we have to make sure we're doing that and also recognising our own response. We have to give voice, if you like, to our own emotional narrative as we're walking through trauma. Very often, particularly in residential community, response to trauma has very, very powerful and emotive expression. And that expression can be overwhelming in itself. Trying to retain some sort of psychological distance from the trauma that we are engaging with is important, but it's also very difficult to do. And that's why we're going to talk in session 2 about how we can be positive about mental health and how we can actually be protective, but I think at this point it's helpful to mention the need for some supervision where there's a safe place to begin to express the emotions that trauma brings about.
To give yourself some space, yes.
Yeah.
Perhaps we move to perhaps a second expression of crisis in ministry, that of the slow burn, just ongoing ministry over the long haul. Rob, perhaps you would speak to that a little bit, how we can actually begin to struggle simply through a daily grind.
Yeah, I mean, you were saying that 7/7's a one-off, or hopefully a one-off event, but you know, the reality of working particularly in more deprived areas is that life events are happening several times a day. You know, people are always losing their jobs, failing to get jobs, poor health, disrupted services. So there's a sort of chronic stress that goes on, and the need is absolutely huge. And I guess one of the things I was thinking is that people often go into work like Eden because they've got a really strong desire. They almost can't not do it. They absolutely have to do it, and they sit down and think, well, what do I want to spend the rest of my life doing? Where does the world's need meet with God's plan for me? And it's not that they don't enjoy the work, and hopefully they do enjoy the work, but it's the fire in the belly that really drives people into it. I like my work. I also like tinkering under the bonnet of a car, but I'm not passionate about tinkering under the bonnet of a car. I am passionate about my work because I believe that people with mental health problems need a fair deal. We need to challenge stigma. So there's that drive. And I think, you know, when you've got the irresistible force, you've got the immovable object of so much need, it takes its toll over time. And, you know, there's something, isn't there, about thinking about staying healthy in the long haul, you know, what you can sustain perhaps for 6 months for a short-term mission trip or a summer program. You can't do that if you're looking at 5-10 years at doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll go to a break shortly and give you some opportunity to have some discussion questions in your groups. But perhaps before we do that, Rob, if you could just give us a 30-second rundown of some of the warning signs for burnout, perhaps that people might experience after doing ministry for some time.
Yeah. Well, I think about it in 4 stages. The first stage is a little bit of stress is good for you. So actually, if you haven't got any stimulus or stress, you're probably going to sit on your bottom. So a little bit of stress is good. You get beyond stress and you get into the sort of using up favours kind of thing, perhaps, you know, where you're calling up your friend for something, or you're borrowing from your savings or something like that. But you're doing okay. You're just using up the biscuits in the cookie jar. It's kind of being worn down. And I think then that what comes after that is warning signs. I'd encourage everyone perhaps to think about what their particular warning signs. I know what mine are: a bit of a tension headache, and if I don't sleep for more than a couple of nights. You know, we all have the odd restless night, but for me, 2 nights not sleeping, I need to have a serious look at what I'm doing. And then I think after that, you're getting very much into the burnout. You're starting to make mistakes. You're having more arguments with people. You're dropping the balls that you're trying to carry. And then after that, at the end of the day, breakdown. And as a psychiatrist, I'm not entirely sure what a breakdown is, but it seems like quite a good word. Your body is saying, I'm pulling over to the side of the road and I'm not moving until something in this car engine is fixed. Yeah. So warning sign, well, using up favours, warning signs, the burnout, mistakes, and then breakdown.
Excellent, thank you. Well, we'll give you some time now to turn into your discussion groups and perhaps think about the impact of those things, what you've seen in your own life through community tragedy or just through long-term ministry, and whether or not you recognise any of those warning signs that Rob's been talking about. So we'll see you in a few minutes. Great, well, welcome back, and I hope you've had a good discussion so far. Welcome back to Will and to Rob. Thanks for being with us. One thing that we really notice when we are dealing with our Eden teams is that often we do our very best as a network to encourage people to have healthy life habits, to give themselves a lot of grace in the work that they do. But often the pressure is within. I want to pick up maybe on what you were saying, Rob, about that inner drive and the passion that drives us to do what we do, that maybe there is something inside us that can that can lead us to having a motivation which is very powerful, but that perhaps needs handling with care as well. My question, I suppose, is what does God expect of us, really, and what might success look like to him? I wonder what your reflections might be on that. Perhaps start with you, Rob, and then Will.
The stakes are high, aren't they? So it's the salvation of the earth.
Yes.
And, and I think sometimes we can sort of remember that the stakes are really, really high and give our own internal drivers to that. And we think, well, I must, should do, ought, all those kinds of things. And as you say, forgetting perhaps the sort of what is God actually wanting me to do. So there's the old adage, isn't there, of, God actually wants living sacrifices, not burnt offerings. Burnt offerings was the Old Testament. We are here now, living sacrifices. It's an act of worship and praise to God. And we're not very good at praising God if we're completely burnt out. And one of the little stories I like from the Old Testament is when Jesus spoke to the guy with the withered hand and said to him, stretch out your withered hand. He didn't just tell him to do it. Presumably he also loosened the muscles, gave the guy power to stretch out his hand. So there's something here about saying, yes, the need is huge, but actually, where's the flow? What is God? What doors is God opening? Let's thinking about out of all the different options, which is the one that seems to be working at the moment. And there is a shared responsibility, isn't there? God has a responsibility in this, and also all the other churches and Christians as well. It's not just up to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Will, from your standpoint?
I think people in ministry start off with the best intentions in the world and often an awful lot of energy. The trouble is often they build up so much energy and so much sort of motion in their ministry that it develops a perpetual energy of its own. And so they've initiated many projects, they've got a connection with many people, they are introducing people to Jesus, they're urgent in evangelism, all this stuff is going on. And then they begin to get more and more tired. But the steamroller of ministry that they've generated is now not being driven by them, it's driving over them. And very often we see this happening amongst young and enthusiastic and unseasoned ministers.
It's embarrassing to stop.
Absolutely.
I think in that your identity is as super minister.
And
you can't stop. And perhaps you even went into ministry because you felt perhaps guilty for your own privileged upbringing, let's say. So you went to work on an even project. There could be drivers coming in.
Many people
from that.
start out sort of, I want to change the world, and actually then they start changing the world. But then the thought or the terror of the idea that actually they might have to peg back their expectations and their activities because of their own human frailty is overwhelming. And what we need to do here is to get a really healthy and a really realistic view of ourselves. It's actually Jesus is the Son of God, he is the model, but he has the power and the authority to do these things. We are his, as Rob said, his servants. And Jesus said in himself, that I don't do anything that my Father hasn't called me to do. I only do what the Father is instructing me to do. Very interesting in Matthew's Gospel that Jesus has healed many, and he's going to Simon Peter's mother's house. But many of those people who came for healing are not being healed, and they're lying on the floor outside of the house. And in the middle of the night, Jesus creeps out of the house and goes up a mountain to spend time with his Father, to be restored. Now, the next day, Simon Peter and the other disciples come looking for him. And this is the lost sheep of Israel looking for the good shepherd. It's an incredible irony. And they say to him, Jesus, what are you doing? Where have you been?
Well, I think
Jesus, well, I'm with my Father.
And I think you see that in Jesus' ministry is that he actually had some of those healthy building blocks in. So he would be taking himself off to do some self-maintenance, I guess we'd call it, when other people thought he ought to be doing stuff.
Yeah, especially healing people. Because
one of the things,
that's the great agenda that they have for him.
And one of the things we want to talk about, isn't it, is about what kinds of things should people be having in their lives so that hopefully they don't get into that 110% kind of thing. It would be great, of course, if everyone has these things right from the beginning. I guess a lot of people listening are perhaps going to have to start putting some of these things in and perhaps be doing slightly less as a result of listening to this.
The whole concept of self-maintenance, I think, is, it can be a bit embarrassing, can't it? It can be a bit countercultural. We're not supposed to be paying attention to ourselves. We've come to give, we've come to serve, we've come to die to ourselves as part of our commitment to Jesus in our community.
But we all have to oil our lawnmowers, otherwise occasionally they seize up.
Acknowledging weakness is the beginning of strength. If we acknowledge our weakness, then we can begin to be strong. If we're to have true sort of success in ministry, starting from a place of acknowledging weakness means that we can begin to see and receive resources. And ultimately, and Paul says, when I am weak, then I am strong. That true weakness enables us to receive the true strength that we need from God, and also from His church and from those who we're collaborating in ministry with. So acknowledging weakness is the starting point of staying sane in ministry, since it's actually acknowledging that we cannot and should not take the full burden of responsibility for everything that we're potentially charged with doing. And I think when it comes to understanding and managing our boundaries and parameters, we have to recognise it's not just us who are driving ourselves, it's the expectations of others, it's the ministries that we've generated, and very often it's also the organisations of which we're a part. There can be an expectation, you should be doing this by now, or other people who've done this work before have got to this stage by now. Me and Rob often talk in psychological terms about 3 words which are quite unhealthy in the internal narrative, and they're should, must and ought. Very often people internally will tell themselves, I should have done this by now, or I ought to have got to this position now, or I mustn't back down, or I mustn't take time out. And what we'd want to do is help people to challenge using those words and actually say, how often are you using those words should, must or ought? And actually, should you not instead have a slightly more generous and realistic view of yourself and actually say, maybe I need a break right now. Maybe I need to pull back. Maybe I need to speak to a supervisor, or I need to ask for advice about how I can
Is
manage
that
my
I should
resources
have
better.
a break?
No, it's maybe I should have a break. I'm going to begin to be soft and not directive with myself.
So watch out for those words in your groups later.
Yes.
No shoulds, must
No
or
shoulds,
oughts.
must or oughts, yeah.
So let's talk then about some of the healthy habits that we could put into place to actually help us to stay sane on the long term. What would you suggest then for someone who perhaps is beginning to feel a little bit of that steamroller, that the machine of ministry they've generated is great, but it is beginning to rule them? How would you help them to make some changes?
I think one of the sort of good things is a sort of a weekly Sabbath, I guess you'd call it, and I guess we sort of need to sort of work out Sabbath means different things for different people. I mean, for Will, his day of rest is not going to be Sunday,
And for many of our Eden teams.
Exactly. Likewise, for me, actually, sometimes going to work is my Sabbath, because the house is full of small children and it's kind of crazy, and going to church certainly isn't restful when you're trying to retrieve them from different bits of the building. But having times in the week where we can pause, where we can spend time with God. Bill Hybels has a great little ditty. He just says, some kind of daily devotion, a weekly worship or some kind of weekly Sabbath, a monthly thing perhaps where you just go for a walk along, a path and just think, and then perhaps annually you just try and get away for a couple of days and just pause and plan. So something daily, something weekly, something monthly, something annual.
Great.
Yeah, that's really
Fantastic.
helpful. Yeah, my view on it is, similar to Rob, but I'm a great believer in kind of talk therapies and dialogue, as a great way of actually being able to review ourselves and to be reviewed by others. And so, I think it's essential that people who are working in the sort of context that Eden teams are working in have really free opportunities, not to present their ministry in a shiny and happy manner, but actually to really talk about the pressures and challenges that they're facing. And very often we disengage from what we call reflective ministry or reflective learning, and the Anglican Church particularly has had a great tradition of this sort of work, and we're very quick to forget it. Being able to reflect back on the work that you're doing, the pressures that you're facing, the resources that are available to you, helps you to moderate your extension. And very often it's only in talking things out that we begin to recognise how we actually feel. And actually we give ourselves permission, another person can give us permission to begin to be more honest with ourselves about the pressures that we're facing. And very often, very practical outworkings of recovery will come from reflective learning on previous experience. The greatest threat for burnout is for people who just get their heads down and get on with it. And the worst thing is when they are praised in a sort of public setting. Joe, he goes and goes, he's unstoppable, let's all lift up Joe, the incredible Superman of ministry, because it creates a model which says, actually, this is what we should be able to do. And unfortunately, Joe is probably falling apart inside.
So if you get very practical about this, I guess some people might have come along to watch these discussions thinking, oh, I could do without this, I've got so much to do. But actually, this is a really powerful and important thing to do. And another really practical thing I was thinking was perhaps each person ought to have one or two people completely outside the Eden network, perhaps a friend from childhood or something who they can just talk to honestly about what's going on and not have to live up to expectations.
So prioritising time for your own self-maintenance and finding vulnerable spaces, vulnerable people that you can be genuinely real with to allow you that space to process what's happening internally.
And also a hobby. I guess there's a reason why Jesus was a carpenter, and I guess he could turn out a fine table. And you need some kind of hobby. My hobbies have changed slightly since having children, but I do like just jumping on the bike for half an hour and just going fast and not thinking about anything. And your brain seems to be in a better order when you get off than when you get on.
Physical work is really, really important, as Rob said, and actually, if we're going to stay well, creating time for things that we love is so, so important. Very often, again, because of the magnitude of the ministry that we're part of, we think, oh, I couldn't possibly take time out to go fishing or to go out on my bike or to go out for a nice meal or go to the pictures. There are people who couldn't possibly
schedule.
And actually, people feel guilty about enjoying things. And actually, I don't think Jesus did. Jesus had lavish banquets with his friends. He enjoyed time. He went fishing. He did the stuff that made sense, and that was good for him, and it was good for the people he was with. And we need to be able to give ourselves permission to do that too. I go running 6 days a week. And for that 40 minutes, I put on some great music and I love it. It just gives me strength every day. And what's really strange is you don't need to be thinking about the problems that you've been facing in the day. In a sense, subconsciously, they're almost processed for you. Very often when you just put your mind to something else and you come to the end, you find some solutions. And I remember Eric Liddell saying, when I run, I feel God's pleasure. And I think we need to hold on to that reality, that it's when we're active, when we're finding refreshing and revitalizing things, that God is pleased with us. He's delights in that. And we've got to get away from a really kind of a legalistic work mode, which actually will break us down and make us less effective ministers ultimately.
I think it's also important to say you don't have to run 6 days a week. That might seem quite a lot.
Absolutely. Well, we're drawing to the end of our time, but thank you so much for your contribution, Rob and Will, to this conversation. And I really hope for all of you that this has been really helpful and will provoke questions for you to discuss in your groups. There's certainly so much that we could have said more in this conversation, but we'll trust you guys to carry it on for yourselves. So thank you and enjoy.